The morning sun over the Hamptons always carried a specific kind of light, pale, crisp, and unapologetically expensive. It spilled across the sprawling back lawn of the Carter estate, catching the dew on the meticulously manicured hydrangeas. Jolena Carter stood in the center of the garden, a pair of vintage silver pruning shears in her gloved hands. At 50, she possessed a quiet, striking elegance. Her honey blonde hair was tied back in a loose, effortless knot, catching glints of silver that she had never bothered to dye. She wore a simple cream cashmere sweater and linen trousers. To the untrained eye, she looked like a comfortable, soft-spoken housewife who spent her days arranging flowers and attending charity luncheons. That was exactly what her husband, Mark, believed her to be. The heavy oak back door swung open, and Mark stepped out onto the bluestone patio. At 52, Mark still clung desperately to the illusion of his youth. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored suit that hugged his shoulders a little too tightly, his hair perfectly coiffed to hide the thinning at his temples. He was the CEO of a mid-sized tech logistics firm, a title he wore like a crown, unaware of who truly controlled the chessboard beneath him. "Morning, Jolena," Mark called out, checking his platinum watch, a gift she had bought him for their 20th anniversary. He walked over, the scent of his overpowering designer cologne cutting through the fresh ocean breeze. He leaned in and kissed her cheek, a practiced, hollow gesture. "Good morning, Mark. Big day at the office?" Jolena asked, her voice smooth and perfectly measured. "Always," he sighed, puffing out his chest slightly. "We're finalizing that merger. It's exhausting being the one steering the ship, you know? But someone has to keep this roof over our heads." He gestured vaguely at the breathtaking $10 million oceanfront property. Jolena smiled, a small, serene smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. I don't know what I'd do without you. Have a good day at work." "Enjoy your book club, honey," Mark said dismissively, already turning back toward the driveway where his leased Porsche Panamera waited. Jolena stood perfectly still, watching the sleek black car disappear down the winding, tree-lined driveway. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, her soft, dutiful smile vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, sharp calculation. He thought he kept the roof over their heads. He actually believed that. Jolena turned and walked back into the house. She bypassed the bright, airy kitchen and moved down the long hallway toward the east wing. She entered her private study, a room Mark rarely entered, dismissing it as her little reading nook. She locked the heavy mahogany door behind her. Pressing a sequence onto a hidden keypad beneath the bookshelf, a false wall clicked and slid open, revealing a state-of-the-art multi-monitor terminal. Jolena didn't survive on a meager pension. She was the sole manager of the Sterling family office, a private wealth management firm protecting her family's generational fortune. She sat down, her fingers flying across the encrypted keyboard. It was time to check the ledgers. For years, Jolena had maintained a single joint household account with Mark. She funded it generously every month, allowing him to feel like the provider while quietly covering the massive property taxes, staff salaries, and maintenance of a lifestyle his mid-level CEO salary could never actually afford. She let him play the king, so long as he respected the kingdom. But today, the kingdom had been breached. A flashing red alert sat in the transaction history of the household account. Jolena leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her thin-framed reading glasses. Wire transfer, outbound. Amount $500,000. Recipient, Cobalt Holdings, LLC. Jolena didn't gasp. She didn't cry. Her pulse barely elevated. Decades of managing ruthless corporate acquisitions had trained her to view crises as puzzles to be dismantled, not tragedies to be mourned. She ran a deep background trace on Cobalt Holdings, LLC. It took her less than 4 minutes to pierce the corporate veil. The LLC was registered 3 months ago. The sole managing member was Mark Carter. "What are you buying, Mark?" she whispered to the empty room. She cross-referenced the LLC's recent activities through her private banking contacts. The $500,000 wasn't an investment. It was a down payment. The asset was a luxury 2-bedroom penthouse in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Jolena tapped her manicured nail against the mahogany desk. A penthouse in the city. Mark despised the noise of the city. He only went in for meetings, unless, of course, there was a reason to stay. She accessed the building's public registry and management files through a backdoor portal her security team used for corporate vetting. She pulled up the resident registration for Unit 42B, primary resident, Anna Mercer, age 25. Jolena pulled up the woman's digital footprint. A struggling Pilates instructor, bright blonde hair, wide, naive eyes, and a social media feed entirely funded by someone else's sudden generosity. The timeline matched perfectly with Mark's sudden increase in late-night strategy meetings. A profound, icy silence settled over Jolena. 25 years of marriage. She had given him a life of absolute comfort, shielded his fragile ego from the reality of her immense power, and let him believe he was a self-made titan. In return, he was draining her money to play sugar daddy to a woman half his age. But Jolena was a woman who dealt in absolute leverage. An affair was petty. A stolen $500,000 was an insult. But before she went to war, she needed to know if there was more. She picked up her encrypted phone and dialed a private number. "Jonathan?" Jolena said, her voice steady and commanding. Jonathan Hale, her family's most trusted attorney, answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Jolena. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I need a full forensic audit on my husband's private financials. Everything outside the perimeter of the joint accounts. Mortgages, lines of credit, hidden LLCs, medical bills. Leave no stone unturned." There was a brief pause on the line. Jonathan, who had known Jolena since she was a teenager, recognized the lethal calm in her voice. "I'll have my best team on it immediately. Are we preparing for a divorce filing?" "We are preparing for an annihilation," Jolena replied softly. "I'll see you at 4 o'clock. At exactly 4 p.m., a sleek black town car pulled up to the estate. Jonathan Hale, a distinguished man in his late 60s with silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit, stepped out carrying a thick leather briefcase. Jolena received him in the grand sitting room. A silver tea service was laid out on the low glass table, steam rising gently from bone china cups. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Jonathan," she said, pouring the tea with a steady hand. Jonathan sat across from her, his expression unusually grim. He unlatched his briefcase. "Jolena, the situation is far more severe than a mistress and a misappropriated $500,000. Jolena stopped pouring. She set the silver teapot down. "Go on." Jonathan pulled out a thick stack of documents, sliding them across the table. "Mark hasn't just been unfaithful. He has been financially reckless to a degree I can barely comprehend. His company's merger? It's falling apart. He has over-leveraged himself in private debts to try and save face and push the deal through." "He doesn't have the collateral for that kind of private debt," Jolena stated, her brow furrowing slightly. "He didn't," Jonathan corrected, pulling a specific heavy document from the stack. He placed it directly in front of her. "Until he used this house." Jolena stared at the paper. It was a commercial loan agreement from a private, high-interest lending firm known for aggressive collection tactics. The loan amount was a staggering $8 million. The collateral listed was the Hamptons estate. At the bottom of the page, next to Mark's frantic scrawl, was a signature. "Jolena Sterling Carter." "He forged my signature," Jolena whispered. The sheer audacity of it hung in the quiet room. "It's a federal offense," Jonathan said quietly. "Mark assumes that because you've been married for 25 years, this house is marital property. He assumes your signature was just a formality to appease the lenders." A dark, dangerous laugh escaped Jolena's lips. It was a sound devoid of any humor. Mark was a fool, a desperate, arrogant fool. He didn't just cheat, he tried to mortgage a castle he didn't own. "The estate is held by the Sterling Generation Trust," Jolena said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "It is not, and never has been, under my personal name. It is legally impossible for him to use it as collateral." "Exactly," Jonathan nodded. "The lenders failed to do a deep title search because Mark utilized a fraudulent notary, someone on his company payroll, no doubt. When the loan defaults, which it will within 30 days given his company's trajectory, the lenders will try to seize the property. They will fail, but the attempt will trigger an automatic federal fraud investigation into Mark." Jolena stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the crashing waves of the Atlantic. The ocean was churning, gray and violent. Her husband had looked her in the eye this morning, kissed her cheek, and left to go build a life with a pregnant 25-year-old, fully intending to leave Jolena homeless and drowning in his debt. He thought she was a fragile, aging housewife who would quietly pack her bags and cry when the bank came knocking. He didn't know she was the bank. "What are your orders, Jolena?" Jonathan asked from the sofa, his pen poised over his legal pad. "We can freeze the accounts. We can alert the authorities to the forgery immediately. He would be arrested before dinner. Jolena placed her hand against the cold glass of the window. No. Jonathan looked up, surprised. No? If we arrest him now, he gets to play the victim, Jolena said, her reflection in the glass looking sharp as a diamond. He will claim desperation. He will cry in court. I don't just want him to face the law, Jonathan. I want him to face me. She turned back to the room, her eyes burning with a quiet, terrifying fire. Let him move her in. Let him think he has won. I want him to stand in the center of this house, believing he is the master of his universe. And then I am going to turn out the lights. Friday evening arrived with a quiet, heavy stillness. The ocean outside the Hamptons estate was painted in shades of bruised purple and deep indigo as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside, the dining room was a masterpiece of understated elegance. It was their 25th wedding anniversary. Jolena stood at the head of the long mahogany dining table, her fingers gently adjusting a centerpiece of white orchids. The table was set for two with her grandmother's antique Limoges porcelain, delicate hand-painted plates trimmed in 24-karat gold that had survived 2 world wars. The silver cutlery gleamed under the soft, warm light of the crystal chandelier. She wore a tailored navy silk dress that draped perfectly over her figure, a single string of flawless South Sea pearls resting at her collarbone. She looked every inch the devoted, refined wife waiting for her husband to return home to celebrate a quarter-century of marriage. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. Right on cue, the heavy front door opened. Jolena didn't move. She simply turned her head, her expression an impenetrable mask of serenity. She heard the familiar, heavy thud of Mark's leather shoes on the marble foyer, but they were accompanied by a second set of footsteps. Lighter, hesitant. The sharp click-clack of designer heels. "In here?" Mark's voice echoed down the hall, lacking its usual boom. He sounded tense, defensive. A moment later, he appeared in the archway of the dining room. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as he took in the candlelit table, the orchids, and Jolena standing there like a queen in her own castle. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine guilt crossed his features. But it was quickly swallowed by the arrogant, hardened mask of a man who believed he held all the cards. He stepped fully into the room, and the woman from the digital files stepped in behind him. Anna. She was young, pretty in a fragile, overly curated way, with perfectly styled blonde waves and a tight designer dress that did absolutely nothing to hide the unmistakable rounded curve of a 4-month pregnancy. She looked around the grand dining room, her eyes widening with a mixture of awe and naked greed. Jolena did not gasp. She did not drop a plate. Her heart rate remained a steady, calm rhythm. She simply rested her hands on the back of the dining chair, her gaze sweeping over the two of them with clinical precision. "Mark," Jolena said, her voice smooth as glass. "You brought a guest. I only set the table for 2. Mark stiffened. He walked forward, dropping his leather briefcase onto the pristine dining table. The heavy thud rattled the antique porcelain. It was an intentional act of disrespect, a clumsy attempt to establish dominance in a room where he suddenly felt very small. "We aren't eating, Jolena," Mark said, his voice hard, though his jaw twitched nervously. "Sit down. We need to talk." Jolena did not sit. She remained standing, her posture immaculate. "I prefer to stand. Who is this, Mark?" Anna shifted uncomfortably, clutching a small Prada handbag tightly against her waist. She looked to Mark for protection. Mark puffed out his chest, slipping his arm around Anna's waist in a possessive, protective gesture. "This is Anna," Mark declared, his chin lifting. "And she is pregnant with my child." He braced himself. He expected the tears. He expected the screaming, the throwing of glasses, the begging. He had prepared a whole speech in his head to shut her down, to tell her how she was too distant, too cold, too old to give him the family he deserved. Instead, Jolena simply looked at Anna's stomach, then back up to Mark's face. "I see," Jolena murmured. "A child, at 52. How ambitious of you!" Mark blinked, thrown off balance by her terrifying lack of emotion. Anger flared in his eyes. He hated when she made him feel inferior. He unlatched his briefcase, pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope, and threw it onto the table next to the orchids. "These are divorce papers," Mark said coldly. "I've already signed my portion. My lawyers drafted a very generous settlement for you. I'm offering you $1 million in cash, Jolena. More than enough for you to find a nice condo somewhere quiet and live out your retirement. $1 million? Jolena almost smiled. The orchids on the table cost more to maintain annually than the sum he was offering to buy her out of her own life. $1 million, Jolena repeated, tasting the words. And what about the house? Mark let out a short, arrogant laugh. The house? Jolena, be reasonable. I'm the CEO. I'm the one who needs the space for entertaining clients. And Anna and I need the room for the baby. You've been living in this massive estate doing nothing but reading and gardening for years. It's time to be practical. He tapped the envelope. Sign the papers. You have 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. Anna is moving in tonight. We'll be taking the master suite. Anna, emboldened by Mark's aggressive stance, finally stepped forward. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the delicate gold-rimmed plates. Mark told me you don't really use this house to its full potential, Anna said, her voice breathy, laced with a feigned innocence. It's so beautiful. Oh, and these plates. She reached out and ran a manicured finger over the rim of the Limoges porcelain. They are gorgeous. Mark said we could keep the furniture. I think this china would be perfect for when we host the baby shower. You wouldn't mind leaving them, would you? It's not like you'll need a setup for 20 people in a small condo. The sheer, staggering audacity of it hung in the air. This girl, barely older than the vintage wine in Jolena's cellar, was standing in a house she didn't own, asking for priceless family heirlooms to celebrate the bastard child of a man drowning in fraudulent debt. Jolena looked at Anna. For a moment she felt a flicker of genuine pity for the girl. Anna was a pawn playing a game on a board she couldn't even comprehend, manipulated by a man who was using her as a prop for his fragile ego. Jolena's silence stretched. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to echo louder and louder. Mark shifted his weight, his arrogance beginning to fray at the edges. Well, Mark snapped. Are you going to sign it, or are we going to have a problem? Jolena slowly reached out. She picked up the manila envelope. The paper was heavy, official. She looked at Mark. He was sweating, just a little, right at the hairline. He was desperate. He needed her out so the bank wouldn't find her when they came to collect on the forged loan. Let him think he has won, she reminded herself. Let him feel like a king before the crown shatters. 24 hours, Jolena said softly, her voice carrying not a trace of anger, but a chilling, absolute calm. You want me out by tomorrow evening? That's right, Mark said, crossing his arms. And you want the master bedroom tonight? Yes. Jolena gave a single, slow nod. She set the envelope back down. Very well. I will sleep in the guest wing tonight. You and Anna may have the master suite. I will have my bags packed and be out of your way by tomorrow afternoon. Mark's jaw physically dropped. Anna blinked, looking almost disappointed that she didn't get to witness a fight. You're just going to leave? Mark asked, his voice betraying his profound shock. He had prepared for a war. He had expected to have to physically drag her out. You've made your choice, Mark, Jolena said, turning her back on him to gather her purse from the sideboard. I have no interest in fighting a man who has already moved on. The settlement is acceptable. I will review the papers with my counsel and leave you to your new life. She walked gracefully past them, stopping just briefly next to Anna. Enjoy the plates, my dear, Jolena murmured. They require hand-washing. I find it's the delicate things that break the easiest when put under pressure. Leaving the two of them standing in stunned, triumphant silence, Jolena walked out of the dining room and ascended the grand staircase. Jolena entered the East Wing guest suite and closed the door. The moment the latch clicked, the submissive, defeated wife vanished completely. She walked over to the velvet armchair and sat down in the dark. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Instead, a slow, predatory smile finally graced her lips. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had just watched her opponent walk blindly into checkmate. She pulled her encrypted phone from her purse and dialed. Jonathan, she said the moment the line connected. Jolena, did he do it? Exactly as we predicted, Jolena replied, looking out the window toward the ocean. He served me with a miserable settlement, demanded I vacate in 24 hours, and moved the mistress into the master suite. She heard Jonathan sigh on the other end. The arrogance of the man is almost pathological. Are you all right, Jolena? I am magnificent, she answered truthfully. The adrenaline of the long game was finally coursing through her veins. He wants to play the titan of industry. Let's give him a stage. What is the status of the company merger? Hanging by a thread, Jonathan confirmed. Mark has scheduled a major dinner party at the estate this coming Saturday to court the key investors and finalize the deal. He believes with the house as a backdrop and you out of the picture, he can secure the final signatures. Perfect, Jolena said, her eyes flashing in the dark. Let him have the house for the week. Let him plan his party. Let him invite every elite contact he has in New York. And what will you be doing, Jolena? I will be moving into the penthouse at the Pierre Hotel, she said smoothly. While I am there, Jonathan, I want you to initiate the hostile takeover. I want the Sterling Trust to buy out the remaining independent board members of Mark's company. I want absolute controlling interest by Friday. It will cost a premium to move that fast, Jonathan warned. I don't care about the cost, Jolena replied, her voice cold and unyielding. By the time Mark stands up to give his toast on Saturday night, I want to be his undisputed boss. I want to own the company. I want to own the debt he forged. And I want the police waiting in the driveway. Phase 1 is a go then, Jonathan said, a hint of dark anticipation in his voice. Rest well, Jolena. Good night, Jonathan. She hung up the phone. Down the hall, she could hear the faint sound of Mark's laughter, the clinking of glasses, and Anna's high-pitched giggling. They were celebrating their victory. They were drinking her wine, in her house, believing they had conquered her world. Jolena leaned back in the velvet chair, perfectly content in the darkness. Enjoy the master suite, Mark, she thought. It's going to be a very long fall from the top of the stairs. The penthouse suite at the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan offered a sweeping panoramic view of Central Park, but Jolena barely noticed the skyline. She sat at the vanity, fastening a pair of vintage Cartier diamond studs into her ears. It had been 6 days since she walked out of the Hamptons estate. 6 days of total silence. Mark had texted her twice, brief, patronizing messages reminding her to sign the divorce papers and asking where she had moved the good silverware. She hadn't replied. Silence, Jolena knew, was the most terrifying weapon you could use against a narcissist. It left a vacuum they inevitably filled with their own anxiety. A soft knock at the suite door broke her focus. Come in, she called out. Jonathan Hale entered, carrying his ever-present leather briefcase, though tonight his posture was remarkably lighter. He looked at Jolena and offered a rare, genuine smile of admiration. She stood up, smoothing the front of her gown. It was a custom-tailored, floor-length piece in midnight blue silk crepe. It had no plunging neckline, no flashy sequins, no ostentatious logos. It was the epitome of quiet wealth, a dress that whispered power rather than screaming for attention. You look formidable, Jolena, Jonathan said, setting his briefcase on the marble table. I feel awake, she replied, walking toward him. Tell me the board voted. Jonathan clicked the briefcase open and extracted a single, heavily embossed folder. The Sterling family office has officially acquired a 68% controlling stake in Vanguard Logistics. The ink dried an hour ago. You are now the undisputed majority shareholder and effectively the chairman of the board. Jolena took the folder. The weight of it in her hands was deeply satisfying. And the forged loan? The private lenders attempted to register the lien against the Hamptons property this morning, Jonathan explained, his tone sharpening. My office immediately blocked it with the deed proving the Sterling Generation Trust holds sole ownership. The lenders realized instantly that Mark's collateral was fraudulent. The federal authorities have been notified of the $8 million wire fraud. 2 officers from the Financial Crimes Division are waiting in an unmarked car at the end of your driveway in the Hamptons as we speak. Jolena closed the folder. The trap was set. The steel jaws were open, waiting for Mark to take his final step. What time is his toast? She asked. He is scheduled to address his investors and the Vanguard board members at 8:30. Jonathan checked his watch. They are currently having cocktails on your patio. Jolena picked up a matching midnight blue clutch. Let's not keep my employees waiting, Jonathan. It's time to go home. 70 miles away, the Hamptons estate was glowing. Mark had spared no expense, using the last of his company's unrestricted credit lines to hire a Michelin-starred catering team, a string quartet, and premium valet service. Dozens of elite investors, tech executives, and high-net-worth individuals mingled under the warm amber string lights strung across the bluestone patio. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of Dom Perignon. Mark stood near the outdoor fireplace, holding a glass of scotch, his chest puffed out in a velvet tuxedo jacket. He felt invincible. Jolena was gone, banished to some quiet, irrelevant corner of the world. The house was his. The company merger was hours away from being finalized. Beside him stood Anna. She was draped in a sequined, champagne-colored gown that was undeniably expensive but entirely wrong for the understated elegance of a Hamptons networking dinner. She wore too much perfume, and her nervous, high-pitched laughter occasionally cut through the low, sophisticated murmur of the crowd. "Mark, the house is simply stunning," said Richard Vance, the lead investor whose signature Mark desperately needed tonight to save his failing company. "I had no idea you were sitting on a property of this magnitude. It speaks to immense stability." "Thank you, Richard," Mark beamed, taking a sip of his scotch. "I've always believed that a man's home is a reflection of his business acumen. Solid foundation, prime location, total control." Anna clung to Mark's arm, smiling brightly. "And it's going to be so wonderful for the baby. We're planning to turn the East Wing into a massive nursery." Richard offered a polite, somewhat strained smile, his eyes darting to Mark. The executives all knew Mark had just dumped his wife of 25 years, and while infidelity wasn't a crime in the business world, Mark's blatant lack of discretion with this young girl was making the older, more conservative investors uncomfortable. "Well," Richard cleared his throat, "assuming the financials you provided hold up, Mark, we should be able to sign the term sheet tonight." "They are rock solid, Richard," Mark lied smoothly. The $8 million fraudulent loan was the only thing keeping Vanguard Logistics from filing for bankruptcy on Monday. "I wouldn't host you all here if I wasn't absolutely certain of our future." Mark checked his watch. 8:25. It was time. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. Clink, clink, clink. The string quartet faded out. The low murmur of this crowd quieted down as 50 of New York's wealthiest and most influential business minds turned their attention to the man of the hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark began, his voice projecting across the manicured lawn, "thank you all for coming to my home tonight. As you look around at this estate, I want you to see more than just beautiful architecture. I want you to see the vision of Vanguard Logistics. We are entering a new era, an era of bold moves, unapologetic growth, and unparalleled success. An era of fraud, actually. But do go on, Mark." The voice was not loud. It was not a shout. It was a smooth, cultured, perfectly projected alto that cut through the cool ocean breeze like a diamond blade. The entire crowd turned toward the French doors leading out from the main house. Jolena stood on the threshold. The patio lights caught the subtle sheen of her midnight blue silk gown. She looked utterly magnificent, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Flanking her, standing just a step behind, was Jonathan Hale, gripping his leather briefcase. The silence on the patio became so profound that the crashing of the ocean waves suddenly sounded deafening. Mark froze, his crystal glass suspended halfway to his mouth. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. His jaw worked silently, trying to form a word, but his brain was short-circuiting. How did she get past security? Why does she look like that? Anna let out a small gasp, taking a step backward, instinctively hiding behind Mark's shoulder. "Jolena?" Mark finally stammered, his voice cracking, the powerful CEO facade shattering in an instant. Several of the older board members who recognized Jolena from corporate holiday parties years ago began to murmur confusedly. Jolena descended the 3 stone steps onto the patio. The crowd naturally parted for her, stepping back as if making way for royalty. She didn't rush. She walked with a slow, measured grace, her eyes locked dead onto Mark's pale face. "Good evening, Richard," Jolena said politely as she passed the lead investor, not breaking her stride. "Mrs. Carter," Richard replied, looking deeply unsettled. Mark finally found his feet. Panic surged through him, making him flush red. He stepped forward, trying to block her path to the center of the patio. He leaned in, hissing through his teeth so the investors wouldn't hear. "Are you insane? What are you doing here? I told you to vacate." Jolena stopped 3 feet from him. She didn't lower her voice. She had no intention of keeping his secrets anymore. "You told me to vacate my own home, Mark," Jolena said clearly, her voice echoing perfectly off the stone walls. "Which I found incredibly amusing, considering your name is nowhere on the deed." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Mark's eyes widened in sheer terror. "Shut up," he whispered frantically. "Jolena, please, we are in the middle of a merger." "You are in the middle of a delusion," she corrected him smoothly. She turned her gaze to the crowd, addressing the investors directly. Ladies and gentlemen, my apologies for the interruption. Mark has a habit of claiming things that do not belong to him. This estate, for instance, is the sole property of the Sterling Generation Trust. Mark has never paid a dime toward its mortgage, its taxes, or even the champagne you are currently drinking. Anna let out a shrill cry. Mark, what is she talking about? You said you owned this. Mark spun toward Anna, his hands raised defensively. Anna, quiet, please. Oh, the house is the least of his lies, my dear, Jolena said, looking at the young mistress with a gaze of cold pity. She turned back to Richard Vance and the other investors. Gentlemen, before you sign any term sheets with Vanguard Logistics tonight, you should be aware that the CEO standing before you committed federal wire fraud 48 hours ago. The patio erupted into gasps. Richard Vance stepped forward, his face hardening. Fraud? Mrs. Carter, those are extremely serious allegations. They are verifiable facts, Jonathan Hale spoke up, stepping forward and opening his briefcase. He pulled out the forged loan document. Mark Carter secured an $8 million private loan using this property as collateral. To do so, he forged his wife's signature on the commercial lien. Mark stumbled backward, his back hitting the stone edge of the outdoor fireplace. No, it's a lie! She's a bitter, jealous woman making things up because I left her, he shouted, his voice shrill, desperate. Richard, don't listen to her. Security! Get her out of here! No one moved. Jolena tilted her head, a cold, merciless smile finally touching her lips. You cannot throw the owner out of her own house, Mark, just as you cannot throw the chairman out of her own company. Mark stared at her, uncomprehending. Chairman? What are you talking about? You're a housewife. Jolena unclasped her midnight blue clutch. She pulled out the embossed folder and handed it directly to Richard Vance. As of an hour ago, Jolena announced, her voice ringing with absolute finality, the Sterling family office, which I direct, purchased a 68% controlling stake in Vanguard Logistics. I bought out your independent board members, Mark. I own the company. Richard Vance scanned the documents. His eyes widened, and he looked up at Mark with utter disgust. The transfer is legal. She owns the majority. Good God, Mark. You forged an $8 million loan? Mark couldn't breathe. The garden, the lights, the faces of the investors. It was all spinning. The carefully constructed lie of his entire life was collapsing in real time. He looked at Jolena, the woman he had underestimated, ignored, and patronized for 2 decades. She wasn't a fragile housewife. She was a leviathan. Mark Carter, Jolena said, her tone shifting from conversational to executive. As the majority shareholder of Vanguard Logistics, I am convening an emergency executive vote right here, right now. All those in favor of immediately terminating the CEO for gross financial misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate fraud, say aye. Aye, Jolena said smoothly. Aye, Richard Vance agreed instantly, stepping away from Mark as if he were radioactive. Several other board members in the crowd immediately echoed the vote. Motion passed, Jolena stated. You're fired, Mark. Mark fell to his knees on the bluestone patio. The crisp knees of his velvet tuxedo soaked up the spilled scotch he had dropped. Jolena, please, he wheezed, the arrogant bravado entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a broken man. Please, I'll fix it. I'll leave Anna. I'll do whatever you want. Anna stared at Mark, kneeling on the ground in tears. Her hands shook violently. You're broke? She shrieked, her voice echoing into the night. You don't own the house? You don't have a job? Mark reached a hand out toward Jolena. Please, 25 years. Jolena looked down at him, her face completely impassive. She felt no anger anymore, only the profound, clean satisfaction of taking out the trash. 25 years, Jolena agreed softly. And you still didn't learn the most important rule of the room, Mark. She leaned down just an inch, her voice a deadly whisper meant only for him. Never steal from a woman who can afford to buy your whole world and burn it down. Jolena stood back up and nodded to Jonathan. Jonathan raised a small flashlight toward the driveway and clicked it twice. From the shadows of the long, oak-lined driveway, the red and blue flashing lights of the unmarked federal police cruisers suddenly flared to life, casting an eerie, sweeping glow over the lavish party. 2 agents in windbreakers stepped onto the patio, their badges visible. Mark Carter? The lead agent said, his voice hard. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and forgery. Stand up, please. Mark let out a broken, guttural sob as the agents hauled him to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back to apply the steel cuffs. The click of the metal locking into place was the loudest sound in the yard. As they walked him away, past the staring, silent crowd of his former peers, Anna turned and bolted into the house, desperate to grab whatever designer bag she could before she was thrown out into the street. Jolena stood by the fireplace, the ocean breeze catching the silk of her dress. She picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing, wide-eyed waiter. She looked at Richard Vance and the remaining executives, raising her glass with a polite, serene smile. "Gentlemen," Jolena said, her voice smooth and welcoming, "I apologize for the theatrics. The catering is paid for the rest of the evening. Please, enjoy the champagne. Tomorrow, we will restructure the company." The velvet tuxedo jacket that had made Mark Carter feel like a king on Saturday night was now stiff, reeking of stale sweat and the sour smell of the precinct holding cell. It was Monday morning. He had spent the last 36 hours on a metal bench, staring at a cinder-block wall that seemed to mock the $10 million ocean view he had lost. His world had not just crumbled, it had been surgically dismantled. When he was finally allowed his phone call, his hands shook so violently he could barely dial. He hadn't called a lawyer. He couldn't afford a good one now that Jolena had frozen the marital assets and his company accounts were locked pending the federal fraud investigation. Instead, he called Anna. He needed someone to believe in him. He needed her to contact his remaining friends, to scrape together the bail money. The phone rang 4 times. Then, it went straight to a harsh, automated voicemail. Mark slammed the receiver against the wall, a raw, jagged sob tearing from his throat. The guard outside the cell didn't even flinch. To the world, Mark was no longer a tech titan. He was just another desperate man in a wrinkled suit who had bet his life on a bluff and lost. He sat back on the metal bench, burying his face in his hands. Jolena, her name echoed in his mind, no longer an afterthought, but a terrifying force of nature. He had spent years treating her like a decorative fixture in his life. He had never bothered to look beneath the surface of her quiet compliance to see the steel underneath. A guard approached the bars, rattling a set of keys. "Carter, you're up. The bail bondsman your public defender called finally put up the surety. You're being released on ankle monitor pending arraignment." Mark stood up, his knees trembling. He was free, but he had nowhere to go. Across town, the rain was pouring down in gray, miserable sheets. Anna stood under the flickering neon sign of a pawn shop in the Diamond District, shivering in her champagne-colored sequined gown. She hadn't changed clothes since she fled the Hamptons estate in an Uber she could barely afford. Her perfectly styled blonde waves were now a tangled, damp mess. In her hands, she clutched a velvet jewelry box. It was her safety net. Mark had given her a stunning diamond tennis bracelet and a heavy sapphire pendant for her birthday 2 months ago. "Only the best for the mother of my child," he had whispered. She walked into the dingy shop, the bell above the door chiming sharply. The pawnbroker, a bored-looking man with a jeweler's loop resting on his forehead, barely glanced up from his newspaper. "I need to sell these," Anna said, her voice trembling as she pushed the velvet box across the scratched glass counter. "They're custom. The bracelet alone was appraised at $40,000. The pawnbroker sighed, pulling down his loop. He opened the box, took out the bracelet, and turned it under the harsh desk lamp. He didn't even bother taking out his testing acid. He tossed it back into the box with a dry, rattling clatter. "I'll give you $50 for the clasps," he grunted. "The rest is junk." Anna stared at him, her heart stopping. "Excuse me? That's a flawless diamond tennis bracelet. My fiancé is a CEO. The pawnbroker let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Lady, your fiancé is a cheapskate. These are cubic zirconia set in gold-plated brass. The sapphire is colored glass. I see guys like him all the time. They buy the fake stuff to impress the side piece while keeping the real money at home with the wife. Take the 50 or get out. You're dripping on my floor." Anna stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. The breath left her lungs. Mark hadn't just lied about the house. He hadn't just lied about the company. He had lied to her from the very first dinner. He had used her as an ego boost, showering her with fake jewels while he desperately tried to steal from a wife who was secretly a billionaire. She grabbed the velvet box, her humiliation curdling into a white-hot, venomous rage. She pulled out her phone, dialing Mark's number. It went to voicemail. "You pathetic, broke fraud," Anna hissed into the receiver, tears of rage mixing with the rain on her face. "You bought me glass? You told me you owned that mansion. Don't ever contact me again. I'm going back to my ex. And if you try to find me, I swear to God I'll testify for your wife." She ended the call, tossed the velvet box into a nearby trash can, and walked away into the rain. By Tuesday afternoon, Mark had managed to secure a room at a cheap hourly motel out by the highway, paid for with the last few crumpled $100 bills he had in his money clip. He sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper. The heavy black GPS monitor strapped to his ankle pulsed with a small red light, a constant reminder of his captivity. He was ruined. His career was ash. His reputation in New York was a punchline. He had lost the estate, the cars, the respect of his peers. A sharp knock at the motel door made him jump. He approached it cautiously, peering through the cloudy peephole. A courier in a sharp uniform stood outside, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. Mark cracked the door open. "Mark Carter?" the courier asked. "Yes," Mark rasped. "Signature required." Mark scribbled his name, took the envelope, and locked the door. He recognized the heavy textured paper immediately. It was the stationery Jolena used for the Sterling family office. His hands began to shake again. Had she sent the finalized divorce papers? Was she suing him for the remaining assets? He sat back on the bed and tore the envelope open. There was no legal jargon, no letterhead, just a single glossy photograph and a clinical lab report. Mark looked at the photograph first. His breath hitched. It was a picture of Anna, sitting at a quiet outdoor cafe. But she wasn't alone. She was leaning across the table, passionately kissing a young, fit man in a baseball cap. Mark recognized the man instantly. It was Kyle, Mark's own 26-year-old executive assistant, the kid who fetched his coffee, the kid Mark had been grooming for a promotion. A cold sweat broke out across the back of Mark's neck. He dropped the photo and snatched up the lab report. It was a prenatal paternity test, legally obtained by Jonathan Hale's investigative team through a subpoena of the clinic Mark had been paying for from the joint account. Mark scanned the highlighted lines at the bottom of the page. Alleged father, Mark Carter. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The paper slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the stained motel carpet. The silence in the room was absolute, pressing against his eardrums until they rang. He had thrown away a 25-year marriage to a woman of staggering wealth and intellect. He had committed federal wire fraud. He had embarrassed himself in front of the entire New York financial elite. He was facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary. And he had done it all for a woman who was sleeping with his assistant. The child he had demanded Jolena leave her own home for, the child he was willing to steal $8 million to support, wasn't even his. Mark Carter fell forward off the mattress, his knees hitting the cheap carpet, and let out a scream that no one in the world was left to hear. 50 miles away, in the gleaming glass-walled boardroom of Vanguard Logistics, Jolena Carter sat at the head of the long oak table. She wore a pristine white-tailored blazer, her posture relaxed but commanding. Around her sat the new restructured executive board. There was no shouting, no ego, no posturing, just quiet, efficient business. Jonathan Hale stepped into the room, leaning down to whisper in her ear. The courier confirmed delivery at the motel. He opened the envelope. Jolena didn't smile. She didn't gloat. A lioness does not celebrate when the mouse realizes it is in the trap. She simply moves on. "Thank you, Jonathan," Jolena said softly. She turned her attention back to the board. "Now, gentlemen, regarding the Q3 projections, we have a company to rebuild, and I prefer to work with a clean slate." The men in the room nodded in unison, hanging on her every word. Jolena looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. The storm had passed. The sky was clear, and the empire was entirely hers. Thursday morning arrived with the sterile, unforgiving hum of corporate Manhattan. Inside the towering glass lobby of the Vanguard Logistics headquarters, Mark Carter sat on a hard, modernist leather bench. He had been waiting since 6 a.m. He was unrecognizable from the arrogant CEO who had thrown a divorce settlement across a dining room table just 2 weeks ago. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was missing, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights in a roadside motel. Every time a sleek black town car pulled up outside the revolving doors, he flinched. At precisely 8:45 a.m., the heavy glass doors glided open. Jolena walked in. She wore a tailored ivory pantsuit that practically glowed in the morning light, a camel hair coat draped elegantly over her shoulders. She was flanked by Jonathan Hale and 2 towering security contractors in dark suits. She moved through the lobby not just as a woman of wealth, but as the apex predator of this particular jungle. Mark scrambled to his feet, his ankle monitor heavy against his leg. "Jolena!" he called out, his voice cracking. The security contractors immediately stepped smoothly into his path, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle and wool. "Mrs. Carter," one of the guards said in a low rumble, keeping his eyes fixed on Mark. "Would you like us to remove him?" Jolena stopped. She looked past the broad shoulders of her security detail and settled her gaze on the trembling, broken man who had once been her husband. There was no hatred in her eyes. There was barely even recognition. She looked at him the way one might look at a rusted, discarded piece of machinery on the sidewalk. "It's all right, Marcus," Jolena said to the guard, her voice calm and even. "Let him speak. I have exactly 3 minutes before my board meeting." The guards parted just enough for Mark to step forward, though they kept him a strict 5 feet away. "Jolena, please," Mark begged, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. "You have to call off the federal prosecutors. You have to drop the civil suit. I have nothing left. The bank froze my personal accounts. My public defender says I'm facing 5 to 10 years. "You committed wire fraud, Mark," Jolena replied simply, adjusting her leather gloves. "The federal government tends to frown upon that. It is out of my hands." "But you own the debt now," he pleaded, a desperate, wet sheen in his eyes. "You own the company. You can tell them it was a misunderstanding. Jolena, Anna left me. The baby wasn't even mine. It was Kyle's. She was sleeping with my assistant the whole time." He expected shock. He expected a sliver of sympathy. He expected the woman who had quietly supported him for 25 years to finally break down and show some emotion. Jolena just stared at him. "I know," she said softly. Mark froze, the breath catching in his throat. You knew?" "I direct the Sterling family office, Mark. I manage billions in generational assets. Did you honestly believe I would let a 25-year-old Pilates instructor move into my home without running a full invasive background check?" Jolena stepped half a pace forward, her presence suddenly overwhelming him. "I knew she was sleeping with your assistant before you even bought her that ridiculous fake diamond bracelet. I knew you were going bankrupt before you even forged my signature. I watched you build your own gallows, Mark. All I did was hand you the rope." Tears finally spilled over Mark's eyelashes, tracking through the stubble on his cheeks. "Why?" he choked out. "Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you just tell me who you really were?" "Because you didn't want a partner," Jolena said, her voice dropping to a register of pure Arctic ice. "You wanted an audience. You wanted a woman who made you feel big because deep down, you have always known exactly how small you are. You traded 25 years of loyalty for a fragile illusion, and now the illusion is over." She turned to Jonathan. "Give him the final paperwork." Jonathan opened his briefcase and pulled out a single legally binding document. He handed it to Mark, who took it with shaking hands. "That is the final divorce decree," Jolena stated. "You will sign it today. You receive no alimony. You receive no assets. And in exchange, I will not pursue the separate civil damages that would garnish whatever minimum wage paycheck you manage to earn when you get out of federal prison." Mark stared at the paper. It was his absolute erasure. "Jolena, I loved you," he whispered, a final pathetic attempt to pull on a string that had been cut long ago. Jolena paused, looking at him one last time. "No, Mark, you loved what I did for you. Goodbye." She turned on her heel, her ivory suit catching the light, and walked past him toward the private executive elevators. The security details seamlessly closed ranks behind her, leaving Mark Carter standing entirely alone in the vast, cold lobby of the empire he had tried to steal. 6 months later, the air on the back patio of the Hamptons estate was warm and fragrant, carrying the scent of blooming hydrangeas and sea salt. Jolena stood by the stone railing, looking out at the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. She wore a simple flowing silk robe, her bare feet resting against the sun-warmed bluestone. She looked younger, lighter, as if a great, invisible weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. On the patio table behind her sat a chilled glass of Sauvignon Blanc and a finalized legal document bearing the seal of the state of New York. The divorce was absolute. Mark was currently serving a 72-month sentence in a minimum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. Anna had vanished back into the anonymity of the city. Jolena picked up her wine glass. Her phone buzzed gently on the table. It was Jonathan. She tapped the speakerphone. "Good evening, Jonathan." "Good evening, Jolena." His warm, steady voice echoed through the quiet patio. "I just wanted to confirm that the transfer was successful. The initial $5 million endowment for the new Sterling Women's Independence Foundation has cleared. The shelter in Brooklyn will be fully operational by next month." Jolena smiled, a real, deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Excellent work, Jonathan. Ensure the legal aid clinic on the first floor is staffed with our best aggressive litigators. I want women who have been financially abused to know they have an army behind them." "Consider it done," Jonathan said softly. "Enjoy your evening, Jolena. You've earned the peace." "I intend to." She ended the call. Setting her wine glass down, she looked at her left hand. For 25 years, a heavy platinum and diamond wedding band had rested there, a symbol of a vow that had only ever been honored by one person. She slipped the ring off her finger. It felt cold and meaningless in her palm. Jolena didn't throw it into the ocean. That would be dramatic, and Jolena Carter was far too practical for melodrama. Instead, she dropped the ring into an empty crystal ashtray on the table. Tomorrow, she would have it melted down and sold, the funds quietly added to the shelter's endowment. She picked up her wine, took a slow, savoring sip, and turned her face toward the sunset. The house was quiet. The ledgers were balanced. The future was entirely her own. Visual cue. The camera slowly pulls back, leaving Jolena standing strong and serene against the golden sunset, the ultimate portrait of quiet victory. Fade to black. Sometimes the loudest victories are won in absolute silence. Jolena didn't have to scream to prove her worth. She simply let the truth do the talking. Thank you for tuning in to Echoes of Betrayal. If you've ever had to find your strength after being underestimated, leave a T in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story of quiet revenge.